Hello besties. Today I'm not so much in a, excited mood because what if I told you a hate crime that ensued became a murder and it happened 30 minutes from my hometown, and both of the individuals who were ruled out maybe to have caused the murder to happen only received 9 months in prison. After that, it was then taken to a Supreme Court level where they received 9 years, did not serve the full 9 years. The woman, the wife of the man who was killed, never received any justice, and her children grew up without a father, all because he was a Mexican man. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about something a little bit more serious that I didn't even know had happened in my hometown until my father-in-law. Basically, my father-in-law gave me a call the other day. We were on the call and he's coming to visit. I live in Texas now. So he gave me a ring and he said, hey, have you ever heard of this story? And I was like, no, what is it? And so there's this Discovery Channel film, and it's basically called Murder Under the Friday Night Lights. Let me make sure I'm getting that correct. Yeah, Murder Under the Friday Night Lights. And for those of you who don't know, Murder Under the Friday Night Lights is essentially basically saying murder in football. So in the football realm, in the football sphere, and because it is Super Bowl Sunday, I want to kind of talk about this because I thought it was an interesting story and I wanted to kind of put this together. It's going to be a long one, so sit down and buckle up because this is going to be a long story. I'm sorry. I can't necessarily be happy because when I'm thinking about this, I'm actually filled with rage. Because the research that I did, it was just, I didn't feel fulfilled after. I felt dirty. I felt yucky, especially knowing that I grew up 30 minutes from this town. So he sent me the full episode that he found online. And then I also had found a movie about this. This murder in 2008 was United States wide, especially even in Mexico. There's people who are enraged about it, and they did a docuseries about it. They did episodes about it. It's on true crime shows. This was something that was big, and because I was 8 years old at the time, obviously I didn't understand the capacity that this crime had on my hometown and the surrounding towns around it. So it's very interesting that I've never heard of it. But I've been, listening to true crime since I was around 10, and this must have happened when I was 8. So it's definitely an interesting story. The town that this story is set in is Shenandoah or Shenandoah. Me being from Pennsylvania, I say Shenandoah because that is the way I was, people around me pronounced it, but the way that other people who are outside of Pennsylvania pronounce it is Shenandoah. And Shenandoah, which is what I'm going to call it throughout this story because that's what I'm used to, is a small town. It only spans 1 mile. All the houses look like coal miner houses, which means they're one on top of the other on top of the other, very close together, no space in between, and very small school, very small class sizes. That's just the way that the Shenandoah area is, and they are very, very into football, and that is why they were on that docuseries, because they believe that their team, I think it's the Shenandoah Valley Blue Devils, are very important. And apparently they were very, very good in the early 2000s at football, so they had nothing more to worry about than the small town football team. These were people, and this is said multiple times throughout the documentary, throughout all the sources, that their great-great-great-grandparents have came from, usually they were Slovak or Polish or Irish or Italian. So those 4 main groups had came years before. So they had deep roots in the Shenandoah area, and they were very much into football. Football was what brought everyone together. And it wasn't until the early 2000s that Hispanic individuals began to influx the northeastern Pennsylvania area. And I know that because I moved to Pennsylvania right near the same area. So not only did the Shenandoah people like football, but they also liked block parties, and we had something very similar in my hometown called Fun Fest, and everyone from all the surrounding towns came to Fun Fest, and everyone goes to the Shenandoah block party because it has foods such as halushki, halupki, any pierogies, any kind of Polish traditional food was found at these block parties, and people would line up miles, especially me as a child, to get halushki. Halushki was our food. And in this story, they say that they welcomed Hispanics at these events, that they welcomed Hispanic culture. I want to go ahead and paint the picture of what was happening here. So they had drinks, rides, food, alcohol, everything. And I grew up eating pierogies and halishkis, especially during school. That was our main meal, pierogies for school. Like, they always had pierogies. So I'm used to this. Like, when I hear the story, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So on July 12, 2008, Daniel Merva and a bunch of his football buddies decided to pregame before the Shenandoah block party that they were going to go to. And so they pregame, hit the block party for a little bit, and then at 9 p.m. Daniel basically says, guys, I gotta go home. Like, my mom's strict, okay? I gotta go home. So he basically clocks out 9 p.m., walks back home. That was his curfew. And as he's walking home, he noticed that the boys walked up towards the Vine Street playground, where he was walking down away from the Vine Street playground. And so Daniel, when he described the Vine Street playground, he said that it was essentially 2 basketball courts sandwiched together with some swing sets in the middle. He described it as barely a playground, nothing much. And that just shows us about the area. It was a little bit of a more rundown area, and they didn't really have much. But between that time and 11:40 is going to be the time that Luis Ramirez was beat up. So let's get into Luis Ramirez's fiance. Her name is Crystal Dillman. Crystal was his fiance. She talks about how they spent the whole day together that day, and essentially she was going to put the kids to bed. So she put the kids to bed, and she was doing what moms do. You know how moms are like, I'm going to clean up for a little bit, watching TV, live my life while the kids are asleep, because that's the only quiet time we have in here. And Luis says, I got to go out, meet with my friend. So he goes out and meets with his friend, and that's what she's expecting. She's expecting him to say, hey, I'm going to go out. Like, I'm going to go and be with my friend. Luis had called Crystal and said, hey, Crystal, like, I'm coming back home. You know, I'm coming back home. Get ready. Like, open the door. Get ready for me. But Crystal called him back multiple times because she said she had a feeling. She had a feeling that either she had forgotten to tell him something, or she had forgotten to, you know, just say something. You know that feeling when you call someone, you just feel like the conversation isn't done, that you had something else you needed to bring up. That's what she felt. So she had called him multiple times and was sent a voicemail. And so she's like, that's interesting. But he's on his way home and he just called me. Maybe he's walking fast, or maybe he's doing something. You know, you make excuses. You're like, maybe they're busy. And she didn't know what happened at first. Essentially, she had no recollection of what was going on. And at 11:40. So Daniel left at 9 p.m. Boys walk up. Crystal puts the kids to bed. Luis goes out with his friend. And at 11:40, the cops receive a call. So the Shenandoah Police Department receive a call of a woman, a neighbor nearby, saying, we need an ambulance. We need an ambulance as soon as possible. There's a man. He's beat up. I can hear them beating him up. Like, the call is, I listened to it and it was, like, I can't even listen to it because it was so sad. And she's basically just describing that he's been beat up, like, beat so bad to a pulp that he's bleeding and he had dents in his skull. And when you hear later on what the boys say as their excuse for this, you're going to be like, there's no way that someone would have dents in their skull that bad if you guys didn't kick them or essentially beat him. So 11:40, they receive the call, and then Eileen Burke, who was a neighbor nearby, looks outside the window where she can hear screaming and she can see a crowd, and she sees Luis Ramirez on the floor. And she was actually the caller to 911, and she went over and kneeled right by his side and tried to wake him up, and he was not responding. He was unresponsive. He was beaten. After Eileen Burke had called the police department, Crystal receives a call from Luis's best friend, and Crystal being Luis's fiance, just trying to, backpedal. So you guys, there's so many names in this story. So Crystal receives that call from Luis's best friend saying, you need to come here immediately. Something is wrong. He's not getting up. Something is wrong. And Crystal says, what? And so she thinks that he fell over. That's like, her assumption is that maybe he was at the park. Maybe he fell over. She didn't think he got beat by a group of football players. She just thought, so she had turned the corner after arriving. And when she looks over to the area, she sees him on the floor, and she was in shock. She believed that he was going to survive this. And by what doctors were telling her when they later arrived at the hospital, she just essentially believed that he was going to survive. She did not know the extent of his injuries, and she could not fathom the extent of his injuries because she was in shock. The love of her life had been beaten to such a poor condition. And so the police actually, when you look back at Eileen Burke's recall of how the police were acting, she said that the police had mentioned something about a guy with a gun in the area, and they basically went out and they stepped right over Luis Ramirez and said, we have a guy with a gun in the area and we have to go look for that guy, and we can't really deal with the situation right now. So there is a man beat on the floor, like dead basically, and they're like, we gotta go look elsewhere. Like, we don't know what's happening, but we think this guy has a gun, so we care about the guy with the gun more. And in the police reports, you can see that the individual that they found was an individual nearby the site of the attack, and the individual had a BB gun, a pellet gun. It wasn't even a real gun. So they went back to the station and filed this report about an individual with a pellet gun and just left the man who was beat on the floor to nearly death, because he later dies in the hospital, but nearly death, just to go back to the station and say, I gotta go eat a sandwich real quick and write a report. I'll be back. You can stay here, buddy, but I'll be fine. And the ambulance apparently took so much time, and Eileen said that she remembers just everything taking time. Like, the police didn't care. Nobody cared. And other individuals had called in, and these are unnamed callers, and they said, the boys are running up from the park. They're running. They're here. They're there. And people were giving the cops their location of the attackers. Giving the location of the attackers to the cops, and the cops were like, no. It had looked like they gave up the search to find who beat up Luis Ramirez in search for someone with a pellet gun, and once they got the person with the pellet gun, they just completely forgot about Luis Ramirez's condition and about the attack that he had faced. So instead of looking for someone who beat someone up to death, you are looking for someone who has a pellet gun, and you just give up. So they wrote out a written statement saying that the person who had the pellet gun was found and that the person who beat up Luis was never found. And they essentially said there was no people who beat up Luis. He found, they didn't even care about his condition. The United States District Attorney's Office, or I guess the state of Pennsylvania, I don't know, one of them, was basically looking into this because it didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense that this man was beat up by 4 to 5 individuals and the police department had nothing to say about it. They had nothing to speak about it, nothing to say, no suspects, nothing. The case went quiet. Nobody had anything to say about this. They wanted to know who did it. When Crystal had gotten to the hospital with Luis, the doctor told her that they were going to do some surgeries and to help decompress the brain swelling that he had from being kicked in the head. And he actually ended up in an unresponsive state, essentially a coma with no brain activity. And she had talked to him, told him that she wanted him to wake up. She gave him kisses. She held his hand. She said the kids were going to miss him, that the kids were missing him already. And she told him all of these things, but he essentially had no brain activity, and the hospital took him off of life support, and he slowly his body began to fail itself. When the coroners had reviewed his condition, he had received a massive blow to the head, and it looked like it had been a kick. Like some football player had decided to full force football kick a man's head. So Daniel Merva, the individual who walked away, the young boy who walked away from the friends who had completed this attack, he actually decided to turn on his phone, and he noticed that he had hundreds of messages, missed calls, voicemails, everything. And they're like, is it true you killed someone? Is it true you killed someone? Is it true you killed someone? And he said that the coach the day before, on a Friday, said, boys, don't get into anything stupid, or don't do anything stupid. And the boys were all like, yes, coach. Just how football players are like, yeah, coach, totally, we're not going to do anything bad. But he had a feeling that they did something bad. while he wasn't there. He didn't know what happened, who did what, nobody was talking. And so everyone was just kind of blaming the football team for this murder of Luis Ramirez. The whole football team was receiving scrutiny for this, even though Daniel went home. So he began to panic. He was panicking. People thought he was a murderer. People thought anyone on the football team was a murderer. And that's definitely like, he was stressed. When we look back at the witness accounts and multiple phone calls, people had identified the suspects as a bunch of members of the football team, of the Shenandoah football team. So the police actually then did one-on-one interviews with the boys. But what the DA's office actually noticed was that the one-on-one interviews were very much spread out, which isn't usually done. When a one-on-one interview is done with a police officer, they usually do 1-1-1. And the reason why they do that is so that you and the other suspects can't cooperate together and come up with some story. They don't want you to do that. They want everyone to have a different story so that they can come up with what is the true story by basically pushing you, saying, this guy already gave you up. That is a tactic that they use all the time, the good cop, bad cop method, and things like that. So it was very strange to the DA's office when they noticed that they had interviews with the individuals days spread apart. The very last interview was the next day. So that guy had a whole day to go and meet up with the other guys and say, hey, you know what happened? Like, what do we do? Let's come up. So the story actually given to the police officers was that there was no alcohol, no kicking, no fighting really, but Luis had heard one of the boys say something to him. Maybe had talked to, and they said Luis was irate. He was erratic. He was attacking everything. He was screaming. He was doing all these things, which when Crystal looks back at Luis's, his demeanor and what he was, she said he was always calm. So why would he be in the street irate, frantic, screaming? That doesn't make any sense. But the boys said that that's what he was doing, and we're going to talk about the boys' account right now. So the boys said that they had walked up to him and he had attacked them or whatever. He threw the first punch, and then one of the boys threw the second punch, and then he jumped, and then they all essentially started to fight Luis. But they said there was no drugs, no kicking, and no slurs, which is a very interesting story to be given, because if you say, yeah, Mom, I had no drinking, no slurs, and no kicking. If as a mother and as someone like an authority figure, you'd say, you're lying. Because it sounds weird that you're just bringing up, hey, there was no, why do you have to bring that up if there was none of them? It really wouldn't even come up in the conversation. But that's what they gave the police. And that's what they were saying. They said they defended themselves from Luis's irate state. So now we're going to get into actual witness accounts. So these are individuals who had seen the fights from their windows, from nearby, from the area, heard the fight, all of it. And their stories are a lot different, mind you. They're very interesting. So Daniel Merva, who was the boy who walked away, he said that they drank. They had alcohol. The boys were drunk. The witnesses and multiple people said that the boys had walked up to Luis. They've walked up to him. They were egging him on. And they essentially hear them speaking Spanish and they say, go back to Mexico, go back to your country. This is America. They start egging Luis on. So he goes to walk up to Brian, which is one of the boys. And as he walks up to Brian, he shoulder checks Colin on accident. And that's Colin Walsh, another football player. And Colin throws the first punch. He throws the first punch. And as he throws the first punch, Luis knocks to the ground. And the boys begin to kick him while he's down. They kick him, they punch him, they're beating Luis up. And this is from what the witness account said. They were saying slurs, they were saying go back to your country. And Luis is saying, he's speaking Spanish. They say that one of the individuals, which this is speculated multiple times throughout the story, who gave the final kick. But when they talk about the final kick, they talk about who had done it. And it was Brandon Pikowski, Derek Donchek, Colin Walsh, and Brandon Scully. 4 individuals who were together that night. One of them gave a final football player kick to the head. That shows malice. That shows that they essentially wanted to kill him. That final kick, how do you think you're going to kick someone in the head at your hardest, step back and kick them and expect them to survive? After all of that had occurred, the night of the beating and Luis's passing, they The entirety of the town basically excused the boys' malicious intent, and they excused the boys' actions by saying things similar to, how could they do that? They're just young boys. They're a football team. They would never do that. Why would they do that? They would never. And they basically excused their actions by saying things like that. Their family all had ties to the town, so everyone knew the town members. And everyone treated Luis as the outsider, someone who maybe had stepped in on their territory. And it can be seen multiple times in the documentary, individuals saying things like, he was in the wrong place, he shouldn't have been in our town, he shouldn't have been in our area, instead of saying, why would the boys kill an innocent man? The two individuals who actually came to the scene were Officer Hayes and Officer Moyer. And Officer Hayes actually knew Crystal Dillman. And Officer Moyer was the other officer at the scene. So these are the two people who essentially just stepped over Luis and left because they could care less. You know, they had to go find the person with the pellet gun more. So there was 4 boys who beat the individual Luis, and then there was the one boy who walked away, Daniel. We're no longer going to talk about Daniel as much throughout this. So when we're referring to the boys during the beating, we're referring to the 4. So Brandon Perkowski, one of the main individuals in this case, his stepfather was actually Officer Hayes. So one of the individuals at the scene. And Officer Hayes was dating Brandon's mom. And Officer Hayes was best friends with Officer Moyer because his child also played football. So very much connections, ties, corruption throughout this story. And they actually launched a DA investigation on this police department's corruption after this case because they could not believe that documents were falsified, and they could not believe that just the way that the treatment of this case, because it had to do with family ties and people within the area. So now we're going to get a little bit deeper into why the DA's office, the district attorney office, decided to look further into it. So when they started to look at the situation, they had noticed that there was actually a meeting at Derek Donchek's house during that night, and they decided to have a meeting, and they apparently went with their parents, and they all talked about what type of story that they were going to come up with. And then there was a meeting the following night at Brandon Perkowski's house as well. So this just shows that there was some sort of, not intent, but some sort of story that they were going to cooperate together to give the police officers. The teens essentially got away with it at the local level because the police officers didn't do any further digging because it wasn't their problem. It wasn't their problem because it was their kids. It was their own family members, their own friends, and they didn't want to persecute against them. So the DA's office actually had to go in circles. It took them 3 weeks to get the case information, the documentation from this case from the local Shenandoah police department. They did not want to give up that file, and the reasoning why was because of the corruption that can be found. This blew up statewide, nationwide. Everyone was worried about it. Civil rights groups got involved. People in Mexico started talking about it. Did you hear what happened? Did you hear what happened? And most of these publications basically called Luis a illegal immigrant. That was their thing. They were playing that angle. They were playing the angle that he shouldn't even have been here, so why does it matter? That was their angle, and I don't like that. That was not correct. He's still a human life. When they actually looked at the report, the DA's office, they had to receive it from the chief of police because Officer Moyer and Officer Hayes were not handing it over, and neither were any of the other police officers. They had to get it from the chief of police, Brian Scully, and the other individual. They basically say, Colin Welsh and Brian, they basically say that the people who delivered the most pain were Derek Donchek and Brandon Perkowski, but they weren't being delivered in the report or even mentioned to the extent that the other 2 boys were. Brian Scully, as I mentioned before, the boy who had guilt about the situation, ended up speaking up once he found out that he was being pinned with the final kick, that he would actually receive a homicide or a murder charge if he didn't speak up. So he decides to speak up and say what happened was the boys had screamed the slurs, and he was the one who spoke up and said they screamed the slurs at him. He got up, Colin essentially got bumped, and they started to fight, and the boys kicked him while he was on the ground, and they continued the kick. But he said that Brandon Perkowski, which is Officer Hayes' stepson, delivered the final blow to the head that had killed Luis Ramirez. which is very much different from what the police report that was turned into the DA's office said. It said that Brian delivered it when really it was Brandon Perkowski, which is very interesting. So when we talk about what was done about the case, the boys were persecuted at the state level and had only received 9 months. And during the trial, Crystal Dillman says that the boys were laughing, goofing, did not care. They were treating it as didn't matter, that they were going to be ruthless, they were going to be relentless, and they were going to get away with it. And the boys were actually convicted of just a simple assault, and any of the larger charges were dropped, and they only received the 9 months in prison at the local level. But then when we go ahead and take a look at what the DA office persecuted for, they actually gave them 9 years. So the boys were convicted not guilty at the state level and the local level, from what I heard. And Crystal actually broke down when she found out what had happened, because these boys were going to be out on the loose in 9 months and had the ability to do whatever they want. After the attention was grabbed by the federal level, that is when it hit the Supreme Court and it became a high-profile case. Colin Welsh actually began to testify against Brandon Perkowski and Derek Donchak. He only received 55 months. Brandon Scully pled guilty to the aggravated assault and other charges. Officer Hayes received no charges. Officer Moyer received no charges. And Brandon Perkowski also got the 9 years. But what is strange, after I did some investigative digging, their 9 years, if it was in 2008, their 9 years, they would be getting out in 2024 or 2025, right? Like, if we really think about it, that is when they'd be getting out. But they're actually out. They're out. So they must have not spent more than, I'd say, 3 years or even less in prison. They had to spend the 9 months at a local level, but they must have not spent the time that they needed to spend in prison at all. If I'm going to go back to what charges they were accounted for, they actually received, they had violated Luis Ramirez human civil rights. That is like hate crime charges. They did not get charged for murder. So let me know what you guys think of this case. If you think that this is insane, if you've ever heard of this case, if you've seen it. I will have resources down below on what I use to perform my research, and let me know if you guys want to see any other cases. And with the link in the bio, you can suggest any cases, and if you know of any cases in the Northeast Pennsylvania area that I can research, I'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you guys so much for watching. Bye!